If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to John chapter 2. This is where we'll be spending our time today. John chapter 2. We're going to look today at the very first miracle, so far as we know, recorded that Jesus performed, as the Gospels have it to be. Jesus and his mother and the disciples are the guests at a wedding, a Jewish wedding. And the wine has run out. And for a Jewish wedding, this would be just an absolute catastrophe. It'd be like if the bride didn't show up. And Mary thinks she can help via Jesus. His disciples, because of this miracle, come to believe in him. Let's take a look at the text and see what it would tell us. John chapter 2, I'll begin reading in verse 1. The third day there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee. Jesus' mother was there. Jesus was also there, and all of the disciples. When the wine ran out, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus says to her, "Woman, what does that have to do with you and me? My hour has not yet come." Jesus' mother said to the servants, "Whatever Jesus tells you to do, you do it." Now there were 6 water pots of stone there set after the Jews' way of purifying, containing 2 or 3 metrites apiece. Jesus said to them, "Fill the pots with water." They filled them to the rim. Jesus said, "Now draw some water out and take it to the ruler of the feast." And so they took the water to the feast that they had drawn out. When the ruler of the feast tasted the water that had now become wine, and didn't know where it came from, but the servants who drew it out knew where it came from, the ruler of the feast called the bridegroom and said, "Everyone serves the best wine first, and when the guests have drunk freely, then that which is worse is served. But you've kept the good wine till now." This is the beginning of the signs that Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and he revealed his glory, and then the disciples believed in him. It's very interesting to me that the disciples then believed in him. I mean, they obviously believed something about him because they were there. They were following him already. And why would they be following Jesus? Well, this was not an uncommon thing in Judaism. At that time in history, young men, and these guys were all the disciples were young, would, if a rabbi came and selected you to follow that rabbi, you would do that. It was not an uncommon thing for a rabbi to have several disciples who would follow him around, and the rabbi would teach. Now, another question arises for me in this text. Why did Mary think that Jesus could be of help here? Now, this at first you think, well, this is a miracle story, so it makes good sense, but that's not the case. There is a reason why Jesus was tapped by Mary. So far as we know, Joseph is dead. So there's no father in the household anymore. And the firstborn in a Jewish household with a widowed mother became essentially the head of the house. So Mary's there, and Mary sees that the wine's run out, and so she does the logical thing. She says to her firstborn son, "The wine's run out." This makes perfect sense. And I wonder, though, this has always perplexed me. Why did Mary ask? Why did Mary get involved? What's the point? And you can see in Jesus' answer, he doesn't understand it either. The fact that Jesus is there is theologically very significant, where we may not see it that way, but it is. Jesus isn't the person to turn down a party. Jesus is God in the flesh. That tells me something about God that doesn't seem to necessarily fit the way a Protestant congregation would see God to be. Jesus is at a party. Remember what they said to him. The Pharisees said, Jesus accusing them, he said, "Look, this is what you say. You look at John the Baptist, and he's so austere and so severe and living so poorly. And you look at him and you say he's crazy. Then you look at me, and I'm eating and drinking, and you say, a drunkard and the friend of sinners and a glutton." So nobody could please anybody. But it says something about Jesus, says something about God. in the fact that he is at this party. And Jesus didn't turn parties down. They probably knew the bride and the groom, probably knew their families. Cana is a very small place between Capernaum and Nazareth. And in a place called the Galilee of the Gentiles. And the reason for that is it's up close to Samaria, and a lot of Samaritans were in this community. And so the Jews in the southern part of Judea did not like the people that lived up here in this part of Judea. Capernaum is Jesus' headquarters as a rabbi. That's where they came from. They went out from Peter's house in Capernaum. Nazareth was where he grew up, and Cana was a little itty-bitty town that was between the two. And there are only 2 mentions of the town Cana in the entirety of the New Testament of which I'm aware, and both of them are in John. This one and then one more. Nathanael is a disciple that comes from Cana, which is why it's mentioned. Wedding was a big deal in a Jewish community. In Judaism, at this time in history, a wedding lasted a week. And it was an insult if you didn't show up. If you were invited and didn't come, you had insulted the family. So you were going to be there no matter what. But it was more than that. It was also that they would want the biggest crowd they could possibly gather. And so in Judaism, if you remember Simon the Pharisee, Jesus is invited to the Pharisee's home, but then this woman shows up as well. What's she doing there? In Judaism, hospitality was seen that way. If you opened your home to people for a meal, anybody who showed up was going to come there and eat the meal with you. And it was expected. You were expected to serve them. So at a wedding, they wanted everything to speak highly of the family of the bridegroom and the bride, but especially the bridegroom, since they were footing the bill. And so they wanted as many people as possible to come to the wedding. The bigger the crowd, the better it said of your family if you were the bridegroom. So they wanted it to be large. I'll never forget, I was asked once, I was working, I don't even remember exactly what I was doing. I was working actually on a pastor's house. I do remember that. And I got a phone call from somebody, a friend of mine in town who was a pastor, and he said, "Rip, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm working on this house." He said, "Can you leave?" I said, "Yeah, I'm in a good spot here. I could come do something if you need me." He said, "I need you to come with me to a funeral." I said, "Okay." I didn't even know the person. I'd never heard of him before. So he said, "Meet me at so-and-so at so-and-so o'clock." So I went home, got dressed, went and met him. And when I got there, he explained the whole thing to me. He said, "This guy, nobody likes this guy. He didn't have any friends." The pastor said, "He's probably going to have 2 or 3 people at the funeral, period." He said, "I just want to show up there, and I thought you could come with me, that would be a few more people at this funeral." And I said, "Okay." So we got there, and sure enough, there was a pastor, 2 people, and him and me, and the dead person. That was it. So it really mattered that we showed up for this family. He said, "I want to go there and support the family by having numbers." Well, that's the way it is with a Jewish wedding. They want to bring in as many people as possible just to show up there because it says something good about the family. You know, part of Jesus' rejection was the fact that he did do things like this wedding. That was part of the reason that all of the Jewish intelligentsia looked at Jesus and said, we don't like you. You're too happy. You do too many things that we don't approve of. You go to places and drink wine." Well, and it's funny to me when this little servant brings the wine up to the head of the feast and says, "Here's the wine." He tastes it and swishes it around his mouth. He says, "Wow, that's the best wine ever. Where did you get that?" Well, they didn't tell him where they got it. They didn't tell him that we got it from the foot washing troughs out back. They didn't say that to him. He would have probably been a little shocked to hear that, because this water that's in these pots, it's about 180 gallons amongst these. A matrit is about 10 gallons, roughly. So if you had these water pots, you had anywhere from 120 to 180 gallons of water back there. It was for ceremonial washing. You washed your feet and your hands and everything, you know, all the purification that the Jews would do, washing all the way up to the elbow, certain ways of washing. The water probably wasn't the kind of water you'd want to stick a dipper in and get some out and drink it. So they didn't tell the leader of the wedding feast there where they got this water, this now wine. But it reminds me, Jesus' attitude about these kinds of things reminds me, say, of David. You remember David? They get the ark back from the Philistines, and they bring it to Shiloh, and David is so happy that he gets out there, and it says he's in an ephod. Now, a lot of people say David was dancing naked. The text doesn't say that. I don't know where that comes from. He was in an ephod, which is a kind of a cloak, and he was dancing before the Lord, and Saul's daughter sees him out there dancing and is embarrassed by it. But I just see that, and I say, this is so much like Jesus, this kind of just this person who was just living the moments of life so fully and so happily. He was a person who was just filled up with living. He was not the kind of person. I love what G.K. Chesterton says about Jesus. He says, you notice in the Gospels it never records anything of Jesus' mirth, that is, his laughter. He said probably if Jesus were to really just take off and laugh, people would probably die. He said, because it's of who it is that's actually laughing. You know, the joy that Jesus could have as God in the flesh would be so overwhelming that people would fall out, he thought, and he said that's why they never recorded it. But this is what Jesus was like. He loved things like this. This thing would have been a tremendous financial burden for the bridegroom's family. Tremendous, because they were going to foot the bill. And so if you ran out of wine, it was a nightmare. It was a total disaster, a huge embarrassment for this family. So this wasn't a big deal. Now, again, we come back to Mary and we say, well, why did Mary feel like she needed to get involved? I mean, when I see Jesus' question, it doesn't surprise me that he would say, what's that got to do with us? I mean, we're just here at the wedding. It's not got anything to do with us, right? And then he adds that strange, cryptic response, my hour has not yet come, which I'm sure Mary didn't have any idea about what that was about. But it was common to expect that she did exactly what a mother would do if she was concerned about something and her firstborn son was there. But that answer is totally perplexing. I just think, why did Jesus add that in that question when he answered Mary's response to the fact that the wine had run out? Why did he bother to say, my hour has not yet come? It's kind of like, I thought of this scenario if I was 12 or 14 years old and my mother said, we've got guests coming, could you go and clean your room? And I said, well, Mom, I don't know what the meaning of life is. I mean, she would just stare at me and say, why are you answering me that way? And I bet you Mary had this moment as well. But you'll notice something in the text, and this is another one of those texts where I think that we don't fully understand it within the language that's there. Jesus isn't being mean. I've seen commentators say, why did Jesus disrespect his mother by saying, what's that got to do with us? I don't think that's disrespectful at all. I don't think that's the case. Because if it were, I think John would have recorded that his mother was put off by the fact of the comment. He doesn't do that. I'm going to say this is just common conversation. I mean, what's that got to do with us, right? We're just here as guests. A lot of people, the fact that Mary doesn't react is what lends me to think that. A lot of commentators look at this whole narrative and they say, none of this ever happened. None of this ever happened. This is just one of these allegories that we should read. It's a teaching text. It's not anything to do with a miracle, because there are no miracles. And there are a lot of commentators, and I've got some fat books at home where these commentators make that case. I'm going to say that's not the case at all. John's narrative here doesn't show any sign of being allegorical. It shows me a sign of somebody who's just recording what happened. Now these jars, being what they were, they don't tell us anything about the time in which this all takes place. But if you look at it carefully, you can see that this is something that's taken place well into the wedding. This isn't something that happened at first. So they've probably been celebrating 3 or 4 days at this point. And the foot washing troughs, the foot washing jars, the ceremonial washing jars would be down a bit. That's why Jesus says, could you come and fill them up first? Before we do this, let's fill these things up to the top. And so the water that's in there is going to be really dirty. Really dirty. Which is why it's such a shock when he goes with this dipper and takes it to the master of ceremonies, who has no idea where this has come from. I doubt he would have put it up to his mouth had he known where they got the liquid. But there are a lot of messages being sent here, not only to them, but to us as well. To them, you've got here what is clearly a very, very Jewish message. If you go back and read the prophets, one of the pictures of God's kingdom, according to Jewish prophets, is there is a superabundance of wine and food. Wine and food. Not just enough, but so much that you can't use it all. There's a lot left over. That's the picture of God's kingdom in the Jewish prophets. And so when you've got 120 to 180 gallons of wine available now, well into the wedding, you've got way more than you could ever use. That's the picture of God's kingdom that's being planted. It's a very Jewish message. And this is kind of what Jesus refers to many times in his responses to people about the coming kingdom of God. And if you read the prophets, that's what you'll find. The master of ceremonies samples it and finds it to be the best, which, as the text says, was not the common way of doing these things. You wanted everybody to get good and snockered so that by the time you brought the wine that was well mixed with water out, nobody cared. Everybody was happy to drink that just as well. But it shows us something else about God. You've got that which is not so good, that which is dirty, the water that's in these pots, being replaced with something that everybody would like to drink. That's telling us something about God's kingdom as well. And this would have been kind of confusing for the Jewish mind, because for them, so much of the ritual is life for them. But Jesus is telling us a different story altogether. He's saying, I'm doing something brand new. It rests on the old, but it's new. It's not the same thing. It's not what you think. What was cold and just a ritual has now become something lively that everybody wants. So we're learning something about God's personality here. Big things. First thing we learn, at least to me, is God really cares about the small things in our lives. You're running out of wine at a wedding. What's that? What importance does that really have in the grand scheme of the world? It tells me something else then about God. He's not reductionist in the way he thinks about your life and mine. What do I mean by that? Well, how many times in here, just like today, Dennis's dog, girl dog, who's sick, or Colin's horse who was sick, or anything like that. Have we prayed about things like that? And asked God to do something about it, to help us through There's a war going on in the Middle East. There's a war going on in Central Africa. There are people starving in another country. Does that mean that because those things are going on, we shouldn't bring these small needs to God? Lord, I really got to get to this job interview. I've lost my keys. No, it doesn't mean that at all. Every person is infinitely important to God, and that means you and me. And so the normal things that we might ask God about, he's concerned about them. We should feel free in bringing those things to him. And then it tells me something else too. The fact of this wedding, the fact of the wine, the fact of the best wine, the fact of the superabundance of wine tells me that the normal pleasures that you and I enjoy are a gift of God to us here on this earth. I mean, the fact we might have a nice meal with our family. Becky and I sat down with our friends from Pennsylvania on Friday and ate pizza till we were about to pop. God appreciates that just as much as he appreciates the fact that we might pray for somebody who is direly sick. The normal pleasures are a gift that we've been given. So what do we learn here? Well, I think that we can say, okay, God, you care about every detail of our lives, and we can freely ask you for anything. Now, that doesn't mean God's going to give it. Just means we can freely ask Him for anything. Nothing is too unimportant that we could bring it to God. And I got to tell you, for me, I don't ever want to be robbed of that by any theology that's going to come and tell me that I'm not to pray about certain things in my life, people I care about, things I care about. And that goes for you as well. But then God's got discretion over those answers. Isn't that nice? I mean, if it was up to me, there's no telling what damage I might do praying for certain things, right? Because maybe they don't fit into a broader scheme that God's got a plan for that I don't know anything about. It might be the best thing in the world that I can't find my keys and I'm going to be really late for that interview. That might be good. I don't know that. So his discretion over our answers to prayer, that's a good thing. His instructions are always simple and easy to understand. Anybody can take a New Testament and read it and understand exactly what life is supposed to look like. It's not hard. And any actions that God takes on behalf of your life or mine, those actions will always be the best, even if they don't look that way to us at that moment. And this one, for me at least, and I just confess this to you all, is the hardest for me of all of them. That is, in all this, I can totally trust God with everything. That's really hard for me. It's really hard for me. I feel a sense of, just like anybody, I hope, when things are going in a way that I don't predictably understand how to respond to, and I'm praying about them, there's always a sense in my mind that, maybe God's not going to come through for me here. I struggle with that greatly, but in the end, I know in my head that God's decisions in all these things will be the very best decisions that could possibly be made, and I can trust Him with everything. It's hard, but that's what He wants. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, I'll stay here as long as it takes as we close.